The strangest neighbors are never the loud ones. They're the ones who apologize so perfectly that you forget to ask why the noise stopped the moment you knocked. Emily Carter had been living in apartment 5B for exactly 12 nights, and she had not slept through a single one of them. The building itself wasn't terrible. It was old, sure, with faded brick walls, creaky wooden floors, and an elevator that sounded like it had been installed sometime before television was invented. But the rent was affordable, the neighborhood was safe, and after months of searching, it had felt like the closest thing to a miracle she could afford. During the day, everything was peaceful. Sunlight spilled through the windows. Elderly neighbors watered flowers on tiny balconies. Children rode bicycles past the entrance while delivery trucks rolled down the quiet street. It looked like the kind of place where nothing unusual had ever happened. Then midnight arrived. At precisely 2:17 every morning, the apartment directly across the hallway came alive. It always started with footsteps. Slow, measured, almost ceremonial. They crossed the floor once. Then again. Then stopped altogether. A few seconds later came the deep sound of furniture shifting, followed by a low vibration that Emily couldn't quite identify. It wasn't music. It wasn't construction. It was something stranger, like dozens of voices speaking behind thick walls where every word blended into one impossible whisper. The sounds never lasted more than 20 minutes, yet they always disappeared the instant she considered calling the building manager. By the 12th night, exhaustion had finally defeated patience. Emily sat up in bed, rubbed her eyes, grabbed the small notebook she used for library inventory lists, and scribbled a message in the neat handwriting her coworkers always admired. Dear neighbor, I don't know what's happening every night, but the noise at 2 in the morning is making it impossible to sleep. Could you please keep it down? Thank you. She folded the paper twice, slipped into her slippers, and quietly crossed the hallway. The corridor felt unusually cold despite the middle of summer. She slid the note beneath apartment 5A's door, hesitated for a second, then hurried back before anyone could answer. The following morning, sunlight woke her for the first time without an alarm. She stretched, smiled, and immediately remembered the complaint. Embarrassment settled in her stomach. Maybe she'd been too harsh. Maybe the neighbor worked nights. Maybe there had been a perfectly reasonable explanation. She opened her front door expecting nothing. Instead, she froze. Resting neatly on the welcome mat was a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in simple brown paper, beside a small bakery box tied with dark ribbon. On top sat a cream-colored envelope bearing only 2 handwritten words. For Emily. She looked both directions down the empty hallway before carefully opening it. Inside was a short note written with elegant penmanship. Miss Carter, I sincerely apologize for disturbing your evenings. Your complaint was completely justified. I promise to do everything possible to prevent future inconvenience. If I fail again, please contact me directly instead of losing another night's sleep. Beneath the message was a phone number followed by a single signature. Lucian. Emily blinked twice. No last name. No explanation. Just a number. She laughed softly to herself, who apologized with flowers, fresh pastries, and handwriting that looked like it belonged in an art museum. Whoever lived across the hall certainly wasn't what she'd imagined. She picked up one of the warm pastries, still carrying the scent of butter and cinnamon, when something made her glance toward apartment 5A. The door remained closed, completely silent. Yet for the briefest moment, she could have sworn someone was standing on the other side, patiently waiting to hear whether she smiled after reading the note. Before she could decide if she was imagining things, the elevator chimed at the far end of the hallway, and 2 men wearing perfectly tailored black suits stepped out carrying polished silver briefcases. Without speaking a single word, they walked directly to apartment 5A, straightened their jackets in perfect unison, and quietly bowed their heads before the door opened from the inside. The apartment door opened without a sound. Emily expected to catch a glimpse of an ordinary businessman, maybe someone who worked impossible hours and simply had strange habits. Instead, the man who stepped into the hallway looked as though he belonged somewhere far older than the century around him. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that fit with effortless precision, his dark hair perfectly combed despite the humid summer morning. His skin was remarkably pale, not unhealthy, but almost luminous beneath the hallway lights. His calm gray eyes settled briefly on the two men waiting outside before they both lowered their heads with unmistakable respect. Neither of them spoke until he gave a small nod. Only then did one quietly hand him a silver briefcase while the other presented a leather folder. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Emily instinctively stepped backward into her apartment before anyone noticed she was watching through the barely open door. Her heartbeat quickened, though she could not explain why. Nothing illegal had happened. Nothing threatening. It was simply unusual. A few moments later she heard soft footsteps crossing the hallway. Curiosity overcame caution. She opened her door again. The mysterious neighbor stood only a few feet away, locking his apartment with an old-fashioned brass key, instead of the electronic keypad everyone else in the building used. As if sensing her presence, he turned. Their eyes met for the first time. His expression softened almost immediately. "Miss Carter?" he asked in a voice so calm it barely disturbed the quiet hallway. Emily blinked. "You know my name?" A faint smile appeared. It was written on the envelope downstairs. I assumed it belonged to the person who left the note. She felt warmth rise to her cheeks. Right. That makes sense. For one awkward second neither of them moved. Emily finally lifted the bouquet slightly. "Thank you for these." "They were not necessary." "They were," Lucian replied without hesitation. "Sleep is valuable." "I interrupted yours." His answer sounded so sincere that she found herself smiling despite remembering nearly 2 weeks of exhaustion. "Well, thank you. The pastries were really good too." "I am relieved." He glanced toward the hallway window where sunlight poured through the old glass. Did the noise stop last night? Emily thought about it. She had actually slept through the entire night after leaving the complaint. "Yes. Completely." "Excellent." He sounded genuinely pleased. "Then perhaps we have solved the problem." Before Emily could ask what the problem had actually been, one of the black sedans waiting outside the building became visible through the entrance below. The two suited men were already standing beside it, watching the front door with patient discipline. Lucian noticed her glance. "Work," he explained simply. "Busy morning?" she asked. "Usually." He slipped a business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. The front contained only his first name and the same phone number from the note. No company. No title. No address. "If the noise returns, please text me immediately," he said. "You should never have to lose sleep because of me." Emily laughed quietly. "You really take neighbor complaints seriously. Some complaints deserve immediate attention." His answer carried an odd weight that she could not quite understand. He inclined his head politely before walking toward the elevator. The doors opened almost instantly, as though someone had already been waiting for him. The two suited men stepped inside first, leaving the center position empty. Lucian entered last. Before the doors closed, he looked back toward Emily and offered one final courteous smile. The elevator descended. Seconds later she heard no conversation, no engine revving, no car doors slamming. Only silence. She walked to the hallway window overlooking the street below. The black sedan had already disappeared, even though less than half a minute had passed. Emily frowned. The street stretched in both directions for nearly a quarter mile. There was nowhere the car could have turned that quickly. She stared a little longer before shaking her head and convincing herself she simply had not been paying attention. Still, as she returned to her apartment, one thought lingered quietly in the back of her mind. For someone who claimed to be just another neighbor, Lucian seemed to leave without anyone ever seeing him arrive or go. Over the next several days, Emily discovered that living across the hall from Lucian was becoming strangely predictable and increasingly impossible to explain. Every morning just before 8 o'clock, a different black luxury sedan stopped in front of the building. It never parked for long. The driver always remained inside while two impeccably dressed men stepped out and waited beside the entrance with perfect patience. Exactly 1 minute later Lucian appeared. He greeted the building superintendent by name, held the front door open for anyone entering, and thanked the elderly mail carrier every single morning. Then he disappeared into the waiting car, which pulled away so smoothly that it almost seemed to glide instead of drive. Every evening he returned alone, carrying nothing except the same leather folder and occasionally a paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. He never looked rushed. He never looked frustrated. He simply nodded politely whenever their paths crossed. Emily found herself looking forward to those brief encounters more than she wanted to admit. One Thursday afternoon, she arrived home with an armful of library books that had been donated for a weekend literacy program. As she struggled to unlock her apartment door, several books slipped from the stack and scattered across the hallway floor. Before she could kneel, another pair of hands carefully gathered them one by one. "Heavy day?" Lucian asked with a gentle smile as he handed her the final book. "Children donated more books than we expected," Emily answered, laughing softly. "I should have made 2 trips." He glanced at the colorful covers. "You work at the public library." She nodded with surprise. "How did you know?" "One of the bookmarks fell out." Emily looked down and noticed the library logo peeking from between the pages. "I guess I missed that." "It happens." His calm expression never changed, but there was something comforting about the way he spoke, as though nothing in the world required rushing. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "You seem to rescue my books every bit as often as you disturb my sleep." Lucian's eyes reflected the smallest trace of amusement. "I hope the balance is improving." She smiled. "It is." That evening, Emily settled onto her couch with a cup of tea and a mystery novel. For the first time since moving into the building, midnight arrived in complete silence. 1 o'clock passed. Then 2. She almost congratulated herself for finally solving the mystery when, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, a single deep vibration rolled gently through the floor beneath her feet. It lasted only 3 seconds before disappearing. Then came another sound. Not footsteps. Not furniture. It resembled the distant echo of dozens of voices speaking at once through layers of thick stone, too quiet to understand but impossible to mistake for ordinary conversation. Emily remembered the business card still resting on her kitchen counter. After staring at it for nearly a full minute, she finally picked up her phone. She hesitated before typing. "Hi. It is Emily from across the hall. I am sorry to bother you, but I think the strange noise is happening again." She almost deleted the message. Instead, she pressed send. Less than 5 seconds later, her phone vibrated. "I sincerely apologize. Please give me exactly 2 minutes." She frowned. 2 minutes. She glanced at the microwave clock. 2:18. The hallway outside remained perfectly quiet. Then, precisely as the digital clock changed to 2:20, every sound vanished. Completely. Even the old pipes inside the building seemed quieter than before. Emily stared at the ceiling in disbelief. Whatever had been making those impossible noises had stopped the instant she sent one simple message. Her phone vibrated again. "Thank you for telling me. It will not continue tonight. Sleep well, Miss Carter." Emily slowly placed the phone on the bedside table. The silence filling her apartment felt almost unnatural now, as though the entire building itself had decided to hold its breath. She closed her eyes, but one question refused to leave her mind. What kind of neighbor could make an entire night become silent simply because someone asked politely? Friday evening arrived wrapped in golden sunlight and cool summer air. Emily left the library carrying a small white bakery box balanced carefully in both hands. Inside were 2 slices of homemade lemon cake from the neighborhood cafe. She told herself it was simply a thank you for the flowers, the pastries, and the unexpected kindness that had turned an annoying situation into something almost amusing. Deep down, she also admitted she was curious. Very curious. She crossed the hallway and stopped outside apartment 5A. Before she could lose her nerve, she knocked softly. No answer. She waited several seconds before trying again. Still nothing. Just as she started turning away, the heavy wooden door slowly opened by itself. "Hello," Emily called carefully. "Lucian." Silence answered her. The apartment beyond looked nothing like she expected. It was far larger than her own, with high ceilings, polished darkwood floors, and tall windows covered by elegant charcoal curtains. Everything appeared perfectly organized. A grandfather clock quietly marked each passing second. Shelves filled with old leather books stretched from floor to ceiling. Fresh white lilies stood inside crystal vases exactly like the bouquet he had given her. "I hope I am not interrupting," Emily said, remaining at the doorway. A familiar voice came from deeper inside the apartment. Not at all. Please come in. She followed the sound until she reached an enormous living room unlike anything she had ever seen. There was no television, no game console, no family photographs. Instead, an enormous fireplace stood beneath a painting so lifelike it almost seemed to breathe. Lucian emerged from another room wearing a simple black sweater instead of his usual suit. Without the formal jacket, he somehow looked younger, though no less composed. You brought something, he observed. Emily held up the bakery box with an embarrassed smile. A peace offering. I figured neighbors should occasionally exchange desserts instead of complaints. A warmth entered his gray eyes. I believe I prefer desserts. He accepted the box with genuine appreciation. Thank you. As he disappeared briefly into the kitchen, Emily's attention wandered toward the massive painting. Above the fireplace, it showed a man standing beneath a storm-filled sky wearing dark ceremonial clothing with an ornate silver crown resting upon his head. His expression carried the same quiet confidence she had already come to recognize. She tilted her head slightly. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Is that your grandfather? She asked when Lucian returned carrying 2 porcelain teacups. He glanced toward the portrait. For the first time since they had met, he paused before answering. Someone very important to my family. Emily nodded politely, sensing he preferred not to discuss it further. They sat across from one another while evening sunlight filtered through the tall windows. The conversation flowed more easily than she expected. They talked about books, favorite bakeries, old buildings, and the strange charm of living in historic neighborhoods. Lucian listened far more than he spoke, but whenever he answered, his words carried surprising thoughtfulness. Emily found herself relaxing completely. Then a quiet knock echoed somewhere beyond the apartment. Lucian's expression changed almost instantly. Calm remained, but something deeper settled behind his eyes. Please excuse me for just one moment, he said gently. He walked toward a pair of large double doors near the far end of the apartment. They opened only a few inches. Emily had no intention of eavesdropping. She simply looked up at the wrong moment. Through the narrow opening she caught a glimpse of at least 6 men and women standing in complete silence. Every one of them wore dark formal clothing. Every one of them lowered their heads the instant Lucian appeared. Then, almost together, they spoke 4 quiet words that drifted through the partially open doorway. Your Majesty, they have arrived. Emily's smile faded. She stared toward the closed doors, certain she must have misunderstood. Your Majesty? She looked around the elegant apartment again. The ancient portrait. The enormous library. The strange visitors. The impossible respect everyone seemed to show him. Suddenly, the mysterious noises at 2:17 every morning no longer felt like ordinary neighbor problems at all. Emily left Lucian's apartment carrying far more questions than answers. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt strangely longer than usual, as though the building itself had quietly changed around her. Outside, the late evening air was warm, and the familiar neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Couples walked their dogs beneath glowing streetlights. A father helped his daughter ride a bicycle across the sidewalk. The nearby coffee shop was closing for the night. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary, yet Emily could not stop hearing those 4 quiet words. Your Majesty, they have arrived. She replayed the moment again and again while lying awake later that night. The portrait above Lucian's fireplace had looked almost identical to him. The visitors had bowed without hesitation. Even the apartment itself felt less like a home and more like a place carrying centuries of history, hidden behind an ordinary apartment door. By morning, Emily had convinced herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps his family belonged to one of those old organizations that preserved historical traditions. Perhaps the title was ceremonial. She smiled at her own imagination while unlocking the front doors of the public library. Throughout the day she buried herself in work, shelving books, helping visitors, and organizing children's reading activities. Even so, every time her phone vibrated, she instinctively wondered whether another message from Lucian had arrived. Late that afternoon, as Emily carried a stack of returned novels toward the history section, she noticed an elderly gentleman studying a large book about medieval European monarchies. He smiled politely. Excuse me, he asked. Do Do you happen to have anything about ancient royal families that disappeared without explanation? Emily led him toward another shelf filled with historical reference books. As she reached for one of the oldest volumes, a folded newspaper clipping slipped from between the pages and drifted onto the floor. She picked it up automatically before realizing it was not part of the library collection. Across the top appeared a faded black and white photograph of an elegant estate, taken nearly 100 years earlier. Standing near the entrance was a man wearing a dark coat. Emily's breath caught. Although the picture was decades old, the man's face looked exactly like Lucian's. Not similar. Exactly the same. She quickly turned the clipping over, expecting to find some kind of explanation, but there was only a handwritten note that read, "Some families never seem to grow old." Before she could think further, the elderly visitor gently accepted the clipping from her hands with a knowing smile. "Interesting coincidence, is it not?" he asked. Emily nodded slowly. "Very. History has a curious way of repeating itself," the man replied before quietly returning the clipping inside the book and walking away. Emily watched him disappear between the shelves. When she looked again only seconds later, he was gone. There was only one exit from that aisle, yet she had never seen him leave. That evening, Emily returned home carrying more questions than books. As the elevator reached the 5th floor, the doors opened to reveal Lucian standing in the hallway holding a paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. He noticed the thoughtful expression on her face immediately. "Long day?" he asked warmly. Emily studied him carefully, comparing the living man before her with the face from the old newspaper photograph still vivid in her memory. Not a single feature seemed different. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. Lucian nodded without hesitation. "You may ask me anything." Emily took a slow breath. "Have you ever looked exactly the same as you do now? For a very, very long time?" For the first time since they had met, Lucian did not answer immediately. His calm gray eyes rested on hers with quiet understanding, and although he remained perfectly composed, Emily realized she had finally asked the one question he could no longer avoid. The next morning, Emily tried convincing herself she had misunderstood what she had heard. People jokingly called successful business owners kings all the time. Perhaps Lucian owned an international company with employees who enjoyed dramatic titles. It sounded unlikely, but it sounded far more reasonable than any other explanation her imagination offered. She buried herself in work, helping children find summer reading books and organizing return novels until closing time. For several peaceful hours, the strange moment inside Lucian's apartment almost faded away. Then her phone vibrated. The message came from an unfamiliar number she instantly recognized. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter. I hope yesterday did not become uncomfortable." Emily stared at the screen before replying. "I am sorry if I interrupted your meeting. I did not mean to overhear anything." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "You have nothing to apologize for. The fault was mine. I should have been more careful." She hesitated before typing the question that had occupied her thoughts since leaving his apartment. "They called you Your Majesty. Was that some kind of joke?" Nearly a full minute passed without an answer. Finally, another message appeared. "It is a title I have carried for a very long time." Emily smiled at what she assumed was an attempt at humor. "You are surprisingly committed to the mysterious neighbor routine." His response came only seconds later. "Sometimes the truth sounds stranger than fiction." Before she could decide how to answer, another notification interrupted the conversation. It came from the building management office. Important notice. Residents on the 5th floor are asked to remain inside their apartments between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock this evening due to a private maintenance inspection. Emily frowned. She had lived there long enough to know maintenance crews never worked at night. Still, the notice carried an official signature, so she thought little more about it. At exactly 8:45 that evening, she looked through her peephole after hearing soft footsteps in the hallway. Instead of electricians or plumbers, she counted at least 8 elegantly dressed men and women quietly taking positions along both ends of the corridor. They spoke so softly she could not hear a single sentence. None carried tools. None wore uniforms. Every person seemed perfectly composed, almost ceremonial. Then Lucian stepped out of apartment 5A. Tonight he wore the same dark suit Emily had first seen him wearing, except a silver pin shaped like an ancient crest rested on his lapel. The moment he appeared, every person in the hallway straightened instinctively. One elderly woman with silver hair approached him respectfully and offered a sealed envelope with both hands. Lucian accepted it with a grateful nod before saying something too quiet for Emily to hear. The entire group followed him toward the elevator without another word. Less than 1 minute later, the hallway became completely empty again. Emily opened her apartment door cautiously. The silence felt almost unreal. She noticed something resting on the floor outside Lucian's door. It was a folded piece of parchment that must have slipped unnoticed from the envelope. She bent down, intending only to return it before anyone came back. The paper felt unusually thick beneath her fingers. Across the front, elegant silver lettering formed a single sentence. Emergency council session regarding human contact. Emily's breath caught. Human contact? Before she could read another word, the elevator chimed softly behind her. She turned to find Lucian standing alone at the end of the hallway. He had returned so quietly that she had never heard the elevator doors open. His calm gray eyes settled on the parchment in her hands. For the first time since they had met, genuine concern crossed his face. He walked toward her slowly, stopping several feet away. "Emily," he said gently, his voice almost a whisper. "There are some truths that once discovered make ordinary life impossible to return to." Emily looked down at the parchment again before carefully extending it toward Lucian. "I did not mean to read it," she said quietly. "It slipped onto the floor." Lucian accepted the document without the slightest trace of frustration. Instead, he folded it once and slipped it inside his jacket. "I know," he replied. "If I believed otherwise, we would not be standing here having this conversation." His answer only deepened the mystery. Emily folded her arms. "You keep saying things that sound impossible. Because my life has never been ordinary." A long silence settled between them. The hallway lights reflected softly against the polished wooden floor while the old grandfather clock inside his apartment chimed somewhere beyond the partially open door. Finally, Lucian stepped aside. "Would you allow me to explain at least part of what is happening?" Emily hesitated for only a moment before following him inside once more. The apartment felt different tonight. The warmth remained, but an unmistakable seriousness lingered in the air. The tea table had already been prepared as though he had expected this conversation for years rather than hours. Lucian poured 2 cups without rushing. "The people you saw tonight are my advisors," he began calmly. Emily gave a skeptical smile. "Advisors who call you your majesty?" "Yes." "And the emergency meeting?" Lucian rested his hands around the warm porcelain cup before answering. "It concerns you." Emily nearly laughed before realizing he was completely serious. "Me? I work at a public library. I pay my rent late more often than I should. There is absolutely nothing important about me." Lucian met her eyes with complete certainty. "That is precisely why they are concerned." She frowned. "I do not understand. Most people fear power. You complained about the noise." Emily blinked. "Because it was 2:17 in the morning." "Exactly." His expression softened with the smallest hint of amusement. "You judged me as nothing more than an inconsiderate neighbor. You expected an apology, not privilege. You accepted flowers but never asked for favors. You treated me exactly as you would treat anyone else." Emily stared at him. "Is that supposed to be unusual?" "Extremely." Before she could answer, a gentle knock echoed through the apartment. Lucian opened the door to reveal the elderly silver-haired woman Emily had seen earlier that evening. She carried herself with quiet elegance, her posture perfectly straight despite her age. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," she said respectfully. "The council requests your immediate presence." Her eyes shifted toward Emily with obvious curiosity, though there was no hostility in her expression. "So this is Miss Carter." Emily stood politely. "Hello." The woman smiled warmly. "It is a pleasure to finally meet the neighbor who filed the famous noise complaint." Emily felt her cheeks grow warm. "I did not realize it had become famous." "Within certain circles," the woman replied gently. "It certainly has." Lucian sighed almost imperceptibly. "Evelyn." The older woman inclined her head. "I understand." She turned toward Emily again. Please forgive us for disturbing your evenings. We are attempting to improve. Emily could not help smiling. Thank you. After Evelyn quietly departed, Lucian remained standing near the door for several thoughtful seconds. She has served my family longer than anyone alive remembers, he said softly. She worries more than she admits. Emily looked around the apartment once again. Every unusual detail suddenly seemed connected. The ancient portrait, the formal visitors, the mysterious meetings after midnight, the impossible respect everyone showed him. None of it felt accidental anymore. She looked back at Lucian. If all of this is real, she asked carefully, why live here at all? Why choose an old apartment building instead of somewhere completely private? Lucian walked toward the large window overlooking the quiet street below. Outside, ordinary people walked their dogs, laughed over coffee, and carried grocery bags home beneath the glow of the streetlights. A peaceful neighborhood. A perfectly ordinary evening. Without turning around, he answered in a voice quieter than ever before. Because after centuries surrounded by people who only see a crown, I wanted to know what it felt like to have a neighbor who only saw a man making too much noise in the middle of the night. Emily remained by the window long after Lucian finished speaking. The city below continued exactly as it always had. A couple laughed while walking their golden retriever. A delivery driver hurried across the street carrying 2 pizza boxes. Someone across the avenue watered flowers on a fire escape. Ordinary lives unfolded beneath an extraordinary secret, hidden only 1 floor above them. Does anyone else in this building know? She asked quietly. Lucian shook his head. No. They deserve peaceful lives untouched by my responsibilities. Emily looked at him carefully. Including me? Especially you. His answer came without hesitation. Before she could respond, another soft vibration passed through the apartment floor. It was much weaker than before, but this time Emily recognized it immediately. The mysterious sound was not random. It was a signal. Lucian glanced toward the closed double doors. The council has arrived. Emily instinctively stepped backward. I should leave. You have done nothing wrong. Maybe not, but I have already complicated your evening enough. A faint smile returned to his face. That is impossible. He escorted her to the front door himself. Just before she stepped into the hallway, he spoke again. Emily. She turned. Thank you for asking questions instead of making assumptions. She smiled. You are still the neighbor who kept me awake for nearly 2 weeks. A quiet laugh escaped him. I suppose I deserved that. She crossed the hallway to her own apartment feeling lighter than she expected. None of the answers she had received made logical sense, yet somehow they felt honest. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emily walked onto the small shared balcony at the end of the hallway with a mug of chamomile tea. The summer air carried the scent of rain even though the sky remained perfectly clear. She leaned against the railing and watched the lights scattered across the city. A moment later, the balcony door behind her opened. Lucian stepped outside holding a porcelain cup of his own. Neither of them spoke immediately. The comfortable silence surprised Emily more than any conversation had. Finally she looked sideways. Does being a king ever get lonely? Lucian kept his eyes on the skyline. Only every day. There was no self-pity in his voice. Only quiet honesty. Emily nodded slowly. I think being ordinary can be lonely too. He turned toward her with genuine curiosity. How so? She shrugged gently. Most people pass each other every day without really seeing anyone. At the library, hundreds of people come through the doors. They remember where their favorite books are. They remember the coffee shop across the street. Very few remember the librarian who helps them. Every week. Lucian listened without interrupting. Perhaps that is why we became neighbors, he said after a thoughtful pause. One person surrounded by too much attention. Another surrounded by too little. Emily smiled into her tea. That is surprisingly poetic for someone who makes so much noise at 2:17 every morning. Lucian lowered his head with unmistakable embarrassment. I am still working on improving that. Before either of them could continue, a black bird landed gracefully on the balcony railing. Around one leg rested a narrow silver band holding a tightly rolled message. The bird walked directly toward Lucian without showing the slightest fear. Emily watched in astonishment as it calmly extended its leg. Lucian removed the tiny message, unfolded it, and silently read the elegant handwriting. His peaceful expression gradually disappeared, not replaced by fear but by deep concern. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Emily noticed the change immediately. "Is everything all right?" Lucian looked toward the quiet city stretching beneath them before answering in a voice softer than the evening breeze. "I had hoped they would give us more time. It seems the council has decided they would like to meet my neighbor in person." Emily did not answer immediately. The city lights shimmered below while the cool night breeze carried the distant sound of traffic through the quiet neighborhood. A few weeks earlier, she would have laughed at the idea that a mysterious council wanted to meet an ordinary librarian because she had complained about noisy neighbors. Now, after everything she had seen, nothing felt impossible anymore. "Do I have a choice?" she finally asked. Lucian looked at her with complete honesty. "Yes, you always have a choice. If you say no, I will make certain they respect your decision." Emily studied his face. Throughout every strange discovery, every impossible conversation, he had never demanded anything from her. He had apologized when he disturbed her sleep. He had answered her questions without anger. He had treated her not as someone beneath him, but as an equal. "Then why do they want to meet me?" she asked softly. Lucian rested his hands on the balcony railing. "Because they cannot understand why I value the opinion of someone who owes me nothing." Emily smiled faintly. "That sounds like a very lonely way to live." He nodded once. "It often is." The following afternoon, Emily returned home from the library carrying a canvas tote filled with borrowed novels. As she stepped onto the 5th floor, she immediately noticed something different. Fresh flowers decorated the hallway. The old light fixtures had been polished until they gleamed. Even the worn carpet looked brand new. She frowned in confusion before spotting the building superintendent arranging another vase near the elevator. "Big inspection today?" she asked. The elderly man chuckled. "I have worked here 28 years, Miss Carter. I have never seen this floor cleaned 3 times in one morning. Your neighbor certainly knows how to motivate people." Emily laughed quietly and continued toward her apartment. A neatly wrapped package rested outside her door. Inside she found a small brass key attached to a handwritten note. "I thought you deserved a quieter home. Please accept this as an apology for every sleepless night." Curious, she walked to the end of the hallway where another staircase led upward. The brass key fit a newly installed door leading to a private rooftop garden she had never noticed before. Sunlight poured across flower beds filled with white lilies, lavender, and climbing roses. Comfortable benches overlooked the skyline, while shelves lined with weatherproof bookcases held dozens of classic novels. A small reading table stood beneath a wooden pergola, complete with a fresh pot of tea waiting beside 2 porcelain cups. Emily slowly turned as footsteps approached behind her. Lucian carried another book beneath his arm. "I asked the building owner if the unused rooftop could become a reading garden," he explained. He agreed surprisingly quickly. Emily laughed. "Somehow I do not think many people tell you no. More than you would imagine." She looked around the peaceful space once more. "You created all of this because I left one noise complaint?" "No," Lucian answered gently. "I created it because every good neighbor deserves a place where silence feels welcoming instead of lonely." Emily felt unexpectedly emotional. No expensive gift had ever carried so much thought. Before she could thank him, the rooftop door opened once again. Evelyn stepped outside accompanied by several elegantly dressed men and women Emily recognized from the hallway. Instead of intimidating expressions, each wore a calm, respectful smile. Evelyn inclined her head warmly. "Miss Carter, we wish to meet the remarkable woman who reminded our king that even the oldest traditions should never come before simple kindness." Emily glanced toward Lucian in surprise. He appeared almost embarrassed. Evelyn continued with quiet dignity. "For centuries we measured greatness by power. You measured it by consideration for another person's sleep. It seems our king chose an excellent neighbor." Emily laughed softly, and for the first time the entire group laughed with her. As the evening sun settled behind the skyline, the 5th floor no longer felt like the home of an ordinary librarian or the residence of an ancient king. It simply felt like two neighbors who had discovered that the strongest bridges are often built from the smallest acts of respect, and sometimes the most extraordinary destinies begin with nothing more than a polite complaint slipped beneath the wrong door.